The Deserter's Refuge. The sun hung low over the Texas Panhandle, a bruised smear of red bleeding into the endless prairie. Caleb Reed's boots pounded the cracked earth, each step kicking up dust that clung to his sweat-soaked shirt. His breath rasped in his throat, sharp as a blade, and the weight of his stolen rifle slapped against his spine. Behind him, the baying of hounds split the dusk, a sound that promised no mercy. He'd seen the bounty hunters' silhouettes against the horizon an hour back. 3 men, lean and relentless, their horses churning the ground like a storm. They'd been tracking him since he slipped out of the Confederate camp near Sabine Pass 3 weeks ago, a deserter marked for a rope or a bullet. The war was crumbling, Lee's surrender a whisper on the wind, but the hunters didn't care about peace. They cared about the $50 on his head. Caleb's legs burned as he crested a low rise, the prairie stretching out like a sea of brittle grass. He ditched his gray coat days ago, trading it for a tattered farmer shirt off a scarecrow, but the stink of fear and gunpowder still clung to him. 22 years old, and he'd already seen enough death to fill a lifetime. Boys gutted by cannon fire, men sobbing for their mothers as fever took them in the mud. He'd enlisted for glory for the South, but all he'd found was rot. When the captain ordered one more charge into Union rifles, Caleb had run instead, the crack of gunfire chasing him into the night. Now, with the hunters closing in, he wondered if he'd traded one death for another. A dry creek bed snaked ahead, its banks studded with mesquite and jagged rocks. He stumbled down into it, knees buckling as he hit the gravel. The hounds' howls were louder now, a jagged chorus that drowned out the crickets. He pressed himself against the bank, clutching the rifle, its barrel still warm from the shot he'd fired an hour ago, a wild miss that only pissed them off more. His canteen was empty, his stomach a hollow pit, and the horizon offered no salvation, just more emptiness. He'd heard tales of the Panhandle, lawless, godforsaken, a place where men vanished into the wind. Maybe that was his fate now. The first rider crested the rise above him, a shadow against the dying light. Caleb ducked lower, heart hammering, as the man's voice cut through the air. "Spread out, damn it! He's close. I smell the bastard." The accent was thick. East Texas, probably some planter's son turned hunter for sport. Hooves thundered as the others fanned out, dust swirling like smoke. Caleb's fingers tightened on the rifle. He had 6 rounds left, but 3 against 1 in the open was a fool's fight. He needed cover, a miracle, anything. Then he saw it. A flicker of movement in the scrub to his left. Not the hunters. Something else. A figure, low and silent, darted between the mesquite, barely a ripple in the dusk. Oh, Caleb blinked, thinking it was thirst playing tricks. But there it was again. A glint of dark eyes, a flash of braided hair, Apache. His gut clenched. He'd heard the stories, scalps dangling from belts, whole settlements burned to ash. The army called them savages, but the army wasn't here now. The figure paused, staring straight at him, and Caleb froze. A boy, maybe 12, his face streaked with dirt, a bow slung over his shoulder. The boy didn't move, didn't shout, just watched. The hounds bayed closer, their shadows stretching long across the creek bed. Caleb's breath caught as a horse snorted above him, so near he could smell the leather and sweat. "Down there!" one of the hunters barked, and a rifle cracked, spitting dirt a foot from Caleb's head. He bolted, legs screaming toward the scrub where the boy had been. Another shot whined past, clipping a branch, and he threw himself flat behind a boulder. The boy was gone, or so he thought, until a hand clamped over his mouth, yanking him backward into a thicket. He thrashed, tasting dust and calloused skin, but the grip held firm. A voice hissed in his ear, low and guttural, in a tongue he didn't know, a woman's voice. He twisted, glimpsing her face, sharp cheekbones, eyes like black flint, a scar slashing her brow. Behind her stood the boy, bow drawn, and an older man with a weathered face and a knife at his belt. Apaches, all of them, their clothes a mix of hide and stolen cloth. The woman jerked her chin, and the boy slipped away, vanishing into the brush like a ghost. Hooves pounded closer, the hunter's shouts overlapping now. Caleb's pulse roared as the woman dragged him deeper into the thicket, her knife flashing in the dim light. She pressed it to his throat, not cutting, just resting there, a warning. "Quiet," she whispered, her English rough but clear. "They find you. They find us." He nodded, barely breathing, as the hound snarled 20 yards away. The older man crouched, peering through the branches, his hand steady on his blade. Minutes stretched into eternity, the hunter's curses fading as the dogs lost the scent in the wind. Caleb's chest ached, his mind racing. These people had no reason to save him. Deserters were nothing to them, just another white man running from his own kind. Yet here he was, alive for now. The woman lowered her knife, studying him like he was a rattlesnake coiled to strike. The older man turned, his voice a low growl in their language, and she nodded. "You run from war," she said, not a question. Caleb swallowed, throat dry as sand. "Yeah," he rasped. "They want me dead for it." Her eyes narrowed, weighing him. Then she gestured to the man. "Nayati," she said, tapping her chest. "I am Nayati. This is Saleh, my father. The boy, Kale, my son." She paused, her gaze cutting through him. "You live because we hide you. But you owe us now." Before Caleb could answer, Saleh spoke again, sharp and urgent. Nayati's jaw tightened. "White men take our people," she said. "Slavers. They camp south near the river. Saleh says you fight with us. Prove you're not just a coward who runs. Or we leave you here for your hunters." She stood, offering no softness, no choice. The distant howl of a hound echoed across the prairie, a reminder of what waited if he refused. Caleb gripped his rifle, the weight of it suddenly heavier. He'd fled one war, only to stumble into another. The night settled over the panhandle like a shroud, the wind hissing through the grass and carrying the faint tang of smoke. Caleb stumbled behind Nayati and Saleh, his boots catching on roots and stones as they moved deeper into Apache territory. The boy, Ka'ali, ranged ahead, a shadow flitting through the dark, his bow a silent promise of vigilance. Caleb's rifle hung heavy in his hands, its barrel cold now, a useless relic of a fight he'd barely survived. His lungs burned from the chase, his body begging for rest. But the Apaches pressed on, their pace relentless. They didn't trust him. Why would they? And every glance from Nayati's flint-hard eyes reminded him his life dangled by a thread. The prairie gave way to rolling hills, studded with junipers and yucca that clawed at the sky. The ground grew rougher, forcing Caleb to watch his step as the trio led him into a maze of gullies and dry washes. He'd heard tales of the Apache, ghosts of the plains, untouchable by cavalry or lawmen. But seeing them move was something else. Saleh, old as he looked, stepped with the grace of a panther, his knife glinting at his hip. Nayati matched him, her strides long and sure, a coiled strength in her frame. Caleb felt like a lumbering ox beside them, his every stumble a shout of his outsider status. They spoke little, their words clipped and in their own tongue, leaving Caleb to guess at meanings. He caught Nayati's name again, spat with a sharp edge by Saleh, and figured they were arguing about him. The old man's weathered face stayed hard, his gaze flicking to Caleb now and then, measuring. Nayati's scar gleamed in the moonlight, a story etched in flesh, and Caleb wondered what had carved it, war, loss, or something worse. He didn't ask. His tongue felt thick, His canteen still dry, and the ache in his legs was a dull roar. Survival was all that mattered now, not questions. After an hour, or maybe two, time blurred in the dark, they stopped at the edge of a shallow ravine. Calais materialized from the shadows, his young face unreadable as he murmured to his grandfather. Saleh nodded, then pointed south, where the horizon swallowed the stars. There, Nayati said, her voice low. The river. Slaver's camp. Caleb squinted, seeing nothing but black, but he trusted her eyes over his own. How many? He asked, his voice a croak. She shrugged. 10, maybe more. They take horses, guns, our kin. Sell them east. Her lip curled, a flash of teeth. You know white men's ways. You tell us. Caleb bristled, the accusation stinging. I ain't one of 'em, he said, sharper than he meant. I ran from that. Nayati's stare didn't soften. You ran from soldiers. These are worse. No flags. No rules. She turned away, leaving him to chew on that. He knew slavers, scum who'd thrived in the war's chaos, preying on the weak, while armies bled. He'd seen their kind in Louisiana, hauling chained men through the mud, their eyes hollow. The thought of facing them now with a rifle and 3 strangers twisted his gut. Saleh led them down into the ravine, the walls closing in tight. The air grew cooler, damp with the promise of water, and soon they reached a trickle of a stream, its banks thick with reeds. Nayati knelt, filling a skin pouch, then thrust it at Caleb. Drink, she said. He took it, gulping greedily. The water cold and tasting of earth. It steadied him, cleared the fog from his head. Thanks, he muttered, handing it back. She didn't reply, just watched him, like he might bolt again. They rested there, the silence heavy. Caleb's mind raced. Bounty hunters behind, slavers ahead, and him caught between with people who'd slit his throat if he faltered. He studied Salih, the old man's hands scarred and steady as he sharpened his knife on a stone. Calais sat apart, restringing his bow, his small fingers deft. A family bound by blood and survival, and Caleb was the intruder. He wondered about the kin Nayati mentioned, captured, sold. Was it a husband, a sibling? He didn't ask that either. The quiet broke when Ka'ale stiffened, his head snapping up. Saleh followed his gaze, then hissed something sharp. Nayati grabbed Caleb's arm, pulling him low. Horses, she whispered. He heard it then, distant hoofbeats, faint but growing. Not the hunters. These came from the south, where the river lay. Saleh crept to the ravine's edge, peering out, then slid back down. His words were quick, urgent, and Nayati's face darkened. Slavers scout, she said. 2, maybe 3. Looking for us? Caleb's grip tightened on his rifle. They know you're coming? He asked. She shook her head. They know we watch. Last moon we took one of theirs, left him for the crows. A grim pride flickered in her voice, but it faded fast. Now they hunt harder. Saleh gestured, and the group moved, hugging the ravine's shadows. The hoofbeats grew louder, a steady rhythm that set Caleb's teeth on edge. He'd fought in skirmishes, killed when he had to, but this felt different, raw, personal, no lines drawn in the sand. They reached a bend where the ravine widened, the stream glinting under a sliver of moon. Saleh stopped, raising a hand. The hoofbeats slowed, then stopped, replaced by voices, gruff, white men's drawls. Tracks here, one said, close enough to make Caleb's skin crawl. Fresh. Damn Injuns skulking again. Another laughed, a wet, ugly sound. Let 'em come. More hides for the pile. Caleb glanced at Nayati, saw her jaw clench, her knife already in hand. Saleh nodded to Ka'ale, who knocked an arrow, his boyish face hardening into something older. The scouts dismounted, their boots crunching on gravel. Caleb counted 2 shadows against the ravine wall, rifles slung lazily over shoulders. Saleh signaled, a flick of fingers, and Nayati whispered, You shoot when we move, miss, and you're dead first." Her tone left no room for argument. Caleb nodded, sweat beading on his brow as he eased the rifle up, sighting down the barrel. The scouts were 10 yards off, oblivious, one lighting a cigar, while the other pissed into the stream. Then Calais loosed his arrow. It flew silent, a streak of death, and buried itself in the cigar man's throat. He gurgled, dropping, and chaos erupted. Saleh lunged from the shadows, knife flashing, as the second scout spun, raising his rifle. Caleb fired, the crack echoing off the walls, and the man staggered, clutching his chest. Nayati finished him with a slash, blood black in the moonlight. It was over in seconds, the ravine swallowing the noise as fast as it came. Caleb lowered his rifle, hands shaking. The air stank of powder and death, and Nayati's eyes met his, unreadable. "You shoot straight," she said, wiping her blade on the dead man's coat. Saleh kicked the bodies into the stream, letting the current take them, while Ka'ale retrieved his arrow. They moved again, faster now, the weight of the kill settling on Caleb like damp rot. Ahead, a faint glow flickered. Campfires by the river, the slavers' outpost. And somewhere in the dark, a scream rose, thin and human, cut off sharp. The scream lingered in Caleb's ears, a raw thread of sound that snagged on the wind and unraveled into silence. The glow of the slavers' campfires pulsed faintly ahead, a smear of orange against the black, maybe a mile off along the river's bend. The ravine had spat them out onto a stretch of open prairie, the grass whispering underfoot as Nayati, Saleh, and Kale moved with purpose. Caleb trailed them, his rifle a cold anchor in his hands, the weight of the scouts' deaths still clinging to him like damp earth. He'd killed before, faceless Union boys across smoky fields, but this was closer, messier. The scout's eyes, wide and shocked as Nayati's knife bit home, wouldn't leave him. They skirted the open ground, hugging a line of cottonwoods that fringed the river's edge. The air grew thick with the smell of water and rot, the current sluggish and dark. Saleh paused, crouching low, his weathered hand tracing a mark in the mud, a hoofprint fresh and deep. He muttered something to Nayati, his voice a gravelly rasp, and she nodded, her scar catching the moonlight. "They moved tonight," she said, glancing at Caleb, "taking captives east. We hit them before dawn, or they're gone." Her words were flat, but her eyes burned, a fire banked, but ready to flare. Caleb swallowed, his throat still parched despite the water earlier. "How many left?" he asked, keeping his voice low. Nayati shrugged. 8, maybe 10. Hard men. Guns, knives, chains. She tapped her own blade against her thigh, a restless tick. "You fought soldiers. These are wolves." He didn't argue. He'd seen the scouts' casual cruelty, heard it in their laughs. Men like that didn't flinch at blood. They drank it. Salai led them closer, the camp's outline sharpening. Tents in a rough corral, shadows of horses shifting in the flicker. Voices drifted on the breeze, slurred with whiskey and menace. Caleb's gut tightened as he spotted figures moving, one dragging a limp shape toward a wagon. The scream's echo made sense now. Captives, Apache or otherwise, bound for some hell-hole market. He glanced at Ka'ale. The boy's small frame taut as he notched another arrow, 12 years old and already a killer. Caleb wondered what that did to a soul, then figured his own wasn't much cleaner. They settled behind a cluster of boulders, the camp sprawled 50 yards off. Saleh gestured, his hands quick and precise, and Nayati translated. "We watch first. Learn their ways, and then strike." Caleb nodded, easing down beside her, the rifle propped against his knee. The camp was a rough circle. 3 tents, a fire pit spitting sparks, the wagon parked near the corral. 8 men he could see, maybe more inside. One stood guard, a hulking brute with a shotgun, pacing the perimeter. Another lounged by the fire, sharpening a bowie knife, its edge glinting as he tested it on his thumb. The rest milled about, their laughter jagged, their boots kicking up dust. Caleb's eyes snagged on the wagon. Shapes huddled inside, shadows of arms and legs, too still. Chains clinked faintly, and he caught a glimpse of a face. Young, female, Apache maybe, her hair matted with blood. Nayate's breath hitched beside him, barely audible, and he knew she'd seen it too. "Yours?" he whispered. She didn't answer, just stared, her knuckles whitening around her knife. Saleh's jaw tightened, his gaze locked on the guard. Hours bled by, the night deepening. Caleb's legs cramped, but he didn't move. He was learning how the guard's pace slowed when he neared the fire, how the knife sharpener drank too much and stumbled, how the horses twitched at every shout. Nayate watched too, her silence a coiled thing, and Caleb felt the shift in her. She wasn't just hiding him now. She was sizing him up, testing him. He'd shot straight back in the ravine, but that was reflex. This was deliberate, a step into their war. The guard paused, spitting into the dirt, and Saleh signaled. Kale slipped away, a wraith in the dark, circling wide. Caleb's pulse quickened. "What's he doing?" he hissed. Nayate's lips thinned. "Horses. If they run, slavers chase. Gives us time." Before he could argue, a sharp whistle cut the air, Kale's signal, and the corral erupted. Horses reared, snorting, as the boy darted through, slashing ropes. The guard shouted, lumbering toward the chaos, and the camp jolted awake. Saleh moved, Nayate on his heels, and Caleb scrambled after them. The plan was unspoken but clear. Use the distraction. Hit fast. He raised his rifle, sighting the knife sharpener as the man lurched up, bottles shattering in his hand. The shot cracked, loud and final, and the slaver dropped, a red bloom spreading across his chest. Nayate darted past, her knife sinking into another man's gut as he fumbled for a pistol. Saleh took the guard, a blur of motion, his blade finding the brute's throat before the shotgun could swing. 5 left, maybe 6, and the camp was a snarl of shouts and steel. Caleb reloaded, ducking as a bullet whined past, splintering the boulder. He fired again, clipping a slaver's arm, and the man howled, retreating toward the tents. Nayate fought like a storm, her movements sharp and brutal, blood streaking her hands. Saleh was methodical, each strike precise, an old warrior's dance. Kale reappeared, his bow singing, an arrow pinning a slaver's leg to the wagon wheel. Caleb's breath came fast, the rifle's kick bruising his shoulder. He was adapting, had to, matching their rhythm, their ruthlessness. He'd run from war, but it kept finding him, reshaping him. A slaver charged, pistol raised, and Caleb met him head-on, slamming the rifle butt into the man's jaw. Bone crunched, and the slaver crumpled, gurgling. Caleb stood over him, chest heaving, the line between deserter and fighter blurring. The fight slowed, bodies littering the dirt, but not all were down. A new sound rose, hooves, distant but closing fast. Nayate spun, wiping blood from her face, and Saleh cursed in his tongue. "More," she said, her voice tight. "From the river." Caleb's eyes darted to the wagon, the captive still trapped, and then to the horizon, where shadows swelled against the dark. Reinforcements or worse. Ka'ale notched another arrow, his small frame trembling but steady. Saleh gripped his knife, blood dripping from its edge. Nayate looked at Caleb, her stare a challenge. "Run or fight," she said. "Choose now." The hoofbeats thundered closer, and with them, a guttural yell, familiar East Texas, the same drawl as the bounty hunter's leader. The hoofbeats rolled in like a tide, a drumbeat of doom that shook the blood-streaked dirt beneath Caleb's boots. The camp was a graveyard now, 5 slavers dead, their bodies sprawled in grotesque heaps, the air thick with gunpowder and the copper stink of death. The wagon sat silent, its captives frozen in their chains, wide eyes glinting in the firelight. Nayati stood over a corpse, her knife dripping, her chest heaving as she scanned the dark. Saleh wiped his blade on a dead man's shirt, his weathered face a mask of stone, while Ka'ale crouched near the corral, an arrow nocked, his boyish frame taut as a bowstring. Caleb gripped his rifle, its barrel hot against his palm, the weight of Nayati's words, run or fight, sinking into his bones. The horizon birthed shapes, 6 riders, maybe 7, their outlines jagged against the faint pre-dawn gray. The East Texas drawl cut through again, a bellowed curse that snapped Caleb's head up. "Fan out, boys! They're here! Smell the damn smoke!" It was him, the bounty hunter from the creek, the one who'd promised $50 for Caleb's hide. His voice was a lash, cracking open memories of hounds and gunfire, of running until his lungs bled. They'd tracked him, or maybe fate had twisted them together again, hunters and slavers tangled in the same filthy web. Nayati's eyes met Caleb's, sharp and unyielding. "Your men," she spat, her scarred brow furrowing. "They come for you." He shook his head, voice hoarse. "Ain't mine. Bounty hunters. Want me dead, same as you want these bastards gone." She didn't blink, just jerked her chin toward the riders. "Then prove it." Saleh barked something in Apache, urgent. And Ka'ale darted to the wagon, slashing at the ropes, binding the captives. 3 stumbled out, 2 women, 1 man, all Apache, their wrists raw from chains. They grabbed fallen weapons, shaky but fierce, joining the line. The riders closed, 50 yards now, their horses snorting plumes of steam. Caleb counted 6, armed to the teeth. Rifles, pistols, a scattergun, glinting in the lead man's hands. The bounty hunter was a bear of a figure, his hat low, his coat flapping like wings. "Reed," he roared, spotting Caleb's silhouette. "No running now, you yellow dog." A shot rang out, kicking dirt near Saleh, and the old man dropped low, his knife ready. The fight crashed over them like a wave. Caleb fired first, the rifle's crack splitting the dawn. A rider jerked, clutching his shoulder, but stayed mounted, cursing. Nayati lunged for cover behind the wagon, her knife flashing as she hurled it, end over end, into a slaver's chest. He toppled and she snatched his pistol, firing blind into the chaos. Saleh moved like a shadow, slashing a horse's flank to unseat its rider, then driving his blade into the man's gut. Ka'ale's arrows flew, one piercing a bounty hunter's thigh, another skimming the leader's hat. The freed captives fought too, clumsy but desperate, one woman clubbing a slaver with a broken plank. The air roared with gunfire and screams, dust choking every breath. Caleb reloaded, ducking as a bullet tore through the wagon's side, splinters stinging his face. He was no stranger to battle, but this was a maelstrom, close, brutal, no lines or orders. The bounty hunter charged, his scattergun booming, and a captive man fell, chest blown open. Caleb sighted him, fired, missed. The horse veered, and the hunter laughed, a wet, savage sound. "Gonna string you up, boy!" he bellowed, wheeling for another pass. Nayati tackled Caleb down as the scattergun roared again, pellets shredding the air where he'd stood. She rolled off, pistol barking, and the hunter's horse screamed, collapsing. He hit the ground hard, rolling, still alive. Saleh was on another rider, dragging him down, their struggle a tangle of steel and blood. Ka'ale darted between shadows, his arrows spent, now wielding a slaver's knife with grim precision. The camp was a slaughterhouse. 3 riders left, the hunter among them, and Caleb's side battered but standing. He scrambled up, rifle shaking in his hands. The hunter rose too, limping, his coat torn, blood streaking his face. "You're mine," he snarled, drawing a pistol. Caleb fired, the shot wild, grazing the man's arm. The hunter returned fire, and pain seared Caleb's side, hot, wet, a bullet clipping his ribs. He staggered, breath hitching. But Nayati was there, her stolen pistol cracking twice. The hunter grunted, dropping to a knee, then lunged, tackling her. They hit the dirt, her knife against his bulk, a desperate thrashing of limbs. Caleb stumbled forward, blood soaking his shirt, and slammed his rifle butt into the hunter's skull. Bone cracked, and the man went limp, his weight pinning Nayati. She shoved him off, gasping, her face smeared with dirt and crimson. "Still alive," she muttered, eyeing Caleb's wound. He nodded, clutching his side, the pain a dull fire. Saleh finished the last rider, his knife buried to the hilt, and Calais stood over a twitching slaver, his small hands trembling. The camp fell silent, save for the crackle of the dying fire and the captives' ragged breaths. Bodies littered the ground, slavers, hunters, one of their own. The surviving captives, two now, clung to each other, their eyes hollow but alive. Caleb sank to his knees, the rifle clattering beside him. His vision swam, the world tilting, but Nayati's grip on his shoulder steadied him. "Not yet," she said, her voice raw. "We move." Saleh scouted the perimeter, his steps slow, blood dripping from a gash on his arm. Calais gathered what he could, arrows, a pistol, a blanket from the wagon. The dawn crept closer, a thin gold line bleeding into the east, but with it came a new sound, distant, faint, a low rumble. Caleb's head snapped up, dread coiling in his gut. Nayati heard it too, her face hardening. "More?" he croaked. She shook her head, uncertain. Maybe, or worse. The rumble grew, a vibration in the earth, and Saleh shouted, pointing south. A dust cloud swelled, too big for horses alone. Wagons, maybe, or a posse drawn by the gunfire. Caleb's wound throbbed, his strength leaking out with his blood, but he forced himself up. Nayati met his gaze, a question unspoken. Could he keep going? He nodded, grim, and she turned to the captives, barking orders in Apache. They moved, limping but quick, toward the river's cover. The rumble sharpened into shouts, and a single word carried on the wind. "Read!" Familiar yet new, a voice from his past, not the hunter's. Caleb froze, the name a hook in his chest, as the dust cloud resolved into shapes, men armed, relentless, and coming fast. The dust cloud rolled closer, a gray wall swallowing the dawn's fragile light. Caleb stood rooted, his side a pulsing ache, blood crusting his shirt where the bullet had grazed him. The voice calling his name, "Read!" cut through the haze, sharp and jagged, a ghost from a life he'd tried to bury. Nayati grabbed his arm, her grip iron, yanking him toward the riverbank where Saleh and Ka'ale herded the two surviving captives. "Move!" she hissed, her scar stark against her sweat-streaked face. But Caleb's eyes stayed locked on the approaching shapes. 10 men, maybe 12, some on horseback, others jolting in a rickety wagon, their rifles glinting like teeth in the rising sun. The camp lay in ruins behind them, a sprawl of bodies and smoldering tents, the air thick with death and ash. The bounty hunter's corpse stared blankly at the sky, his skull caved in, a testament to Caleb's choice, fight, not run. But this new threat wasn't slavers or hunters. That voice, hoarse and furious, belonged to someone he knew. Amos Tate, a sergeant from his old regiment, a man who'd sworn to gut any deserter himself. Caleb's flight from Sabine Pass hadn't just drawn bounty hunters. It had pulled the war's dying embers after him, men too bitter to let the South's collapse end their hunt. Saleh reached the river's edge, the captives splashing into the shallows, their stolen blanket dragging in the current. Ka'ale turned, his young face pale but fierce, a pistol clutched in his small hands. The rumble of hooves and creaking wheels was loud now, 30 yards off, and Amos's voice rang again. "Caleb Reed, you traitorous son of a show yourself." The words were a lash, stripping away the deserter's fragile armor. Caleb's knees buckled, but Nayati held him up, her eyes boring into his. "Who?" she demanded. "Soldiers," he rasped, the pain in his side flaring. "Mine. From before." Her jaw tightened, understanding flickering. She'd seen white men's vengeance before, felt its weight in the kin she'd lost to slavers. Saleh shouted in Apache, waving them toward a thicket of willows downstream, but the riders fanned out, cutting off the path. A rifle cracked, spitting water near Ka'ali, and the boy ducked, firing back wildly. The captives froze, one woman sobbing, the other clutching a knife she barely knew how to hold. Caleb's mind raced, the past and present colliding. Amos wouldn't stop, wouldn't care about Apaches or slavers, only the deserter he'd sworn to hang. Caleb could run again, slip into the wilderness, let Nayati and her family fade into the chaos. He'd survived that way before. But the weight of the rifle in his hands, the blood on his shirt, the bodies he'd left behind, they anchored him. Running had brought him here, to this moment, and it wouldn't save him now. Nayati shoved him toward the willows. "Go! We hold them!" Saleh was already moving, his wounded arm trailing blood as he flanked the riders, knife flashing. Ka'ale fired again, a horse rearing as its rider cursed. Caleb stumbled and stopped, turning back. "No," he said, his voice steady, despite the tremor in his legs. "I brought this. I end it." Nayati stared, her expression unreadable, then nodded once, sharp and final. He faced the riders, stepping into the open, rifle raised. The wagon jolted to a halt, and Amos dismounted, a broad, grizzled man, his gray uniform tattered, his eyes burning with hate. "There you are," he growled, drawing a revolver. "Thought you'd outrun me, boy." His men spread out, some aiming at Caleb, others scanning the willows where shadows moved. "War's over, Amos," Caleb said, forcing the words out. "Let it go." Amos spat, his laugh a rasp. "Over for Lee, maybe. Not for me. Not for you." A shot rang out, not Amos's, but Saleh's from the flank. A soldier toppled, clutching his neck, and chaos erupted. Nayati burst from the thicket, pistol blazing, her bullets punching through a rider's chest. Kale's stolen gun barked, felling another. Caleb fired, the rifle's kick jarring his wound, and Amos staggered, a red bloom spreading across his thigh. The sergeant roared, returning fire, and Caleb dove, dirt exploding around him. The captives joined the fray, their desperation a wild force, one woman stabbing a soldier with her knife, the other hurling rocks. The fight was short, brutal, a storm of steel and screams. Amos's men fell, outmatched by the ferocity of Caleb's makeshift band. Saleh took a bullet to the shoulder, but kept fighting, his knife a blur. Ka'ale darted between bodies, his small size a shield. Nayati wrestled a soldier down, snapping his neck with a twist. Caleb crawled toward Amos, who knelt in the mud, revolver empty, blood pooling beneath him. "Damn you!" Amos wheezed, his eyes fading. Caleb didn't answer, just drove his rifle butt into the man's temple, silencing him. The last soldier fled, horse galloping into the dawn, and silence fell, heavy as a shroud. Caleb slumped, his wound a screaming agony, the world tilting. Nayati knelt beside him, her hands pressing his side, staunching the blood. "Fool," she muttered, but her tone held no venom. Saleh limped over, his arm bound with a strip of cloth, the captives trailing behind, alive but hollowed out. Ka'ale stood watch, his pistol still ready, a boy no longer just a boy. The sun crested the horizon, painting the river gold, the camp's wreckage a dark scar against it. Caleb's breath steadied, Nayati's touch grounding him. "What now?" she asked, her voice soft, a question for them both. He looked at the captives, at Saleh's grim resolve, at Ka'ale's quiet strength. He'd run from one war, fought another, and now stood at a crossroads. Stay with these people, build something from the ashes, or walk away, a ghost again. I stay, he said, the words heavy, final. Help you rebuild. Fight if they come again. Nayati nodded, a flicker of something, respect, maybe trust, crossing her face. Saleh grunted, approval or exhaustion. And Ka'ali lowered his gun, the dawn catching in his dark eyes. They moved together, gathering what they could. Weapons, blankets, a slaver's horse that hadn't bolted. The river flowed on, indifferent, washing away the blood of the night. Caleb glanced back once at the bodies in the dust, then forward toward the hills where smoke rose thin and distant. Apache fires, a signal of home. The sun climbed higher, and a lone hawk wheeled overhead, its cry piercing the stillness, a mark of endings and beginnings etched against the endless sky.